So I have shared this bit of my past with you in, I don't know, maybe in the first year that I was here. So for some of you, you might remember this and it'll be a repeat, but many of you, it will not. So I grew up attending a church in small town Minnesota, well, just kind of like west of Minneapolis. Princeburg is the town. And many of the people that I grew up with, it was a small town farm, a lot of farming people, a lot of people who were like second generation immigrants from Europe. And here's the thing, they smoked. A lot of people smoked. And after church, so here at Bethel, we gather we call it the gathering place, and we visit for a long time. In my church, it was like an old church that had no lobby, no entranceway, no fellowship hall at all. It was just one long building, that we worshiped in. So we hung out outside. And I just remember as a kid going outside after church, and it was cigarette smoke because people were smoking as they were hanging out. And again, they grew up in Europe, or their ancestors did. They didn't really think too much of it. They don't do it today. I mean, there's been more and more of a push about the unhealth of smoking, whatever. So that's what I grew up in. I got involved in a band that had a variety of Christians that were part of this band from other churches, and I became aware of other kinds of churches that had different ways of doing things, and they were very much against smoking. And so they thought that people in my church who smoked were terrible. They were not godly people because smoking was terrible, was sinful. So, however, the group that I grew up in, they very much were focused on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. So that was a day set aside to have time with family and for worship. You don't go to a store on Sunday. You don't go to a restaurant on Sunday because that's dishonoring the Lord's Day. Does anyone remember that? Did anyone grow up with that kind of mindset? So there was I think it was by the time Charlene and I were in college and then went to seminary, I would still sometimes go to a store on Sunday and feel a little guilt, like have these weird feelings. Well, anyway, so here you have a situation. So the second picture, you may not be able to see it. So there's a guy walking by people in a restaurant. So you can imagine in my hometown, a town near us, Wilmer, a guy from one of the evangelical churches in town, they would go out to eat after church, right? So imagine a guy from my church, from Bundy CRC, walking by the restaurant and seeing this guy who he knows is a Christian going into and eating in a restaurant and judging that person like he's not a very godly person because he's eating in a restaurant on Sunday. Meanwhile, he's smoking his cigarette as he feels these feelings of superiority and judgment towards this other person. Meanwhile, the person is in the restaurant having a great fellowship time after a great worship service, and he sees this other guy walking by smoking a cigarette, and he feels a sense of superiority and judgment on that guy for smoking. So this was confusing to me. And I've come to believe that one of the great challenges we have in the church is figuring out how we deal with our differences. And we just, it seems like sometime it's like the favorite hobby of Christians to figure out things that they believe are important and then identify the people that don't agree with them so that they can now feel a little bit more superior and then begin to feel judgmental towards those people who have different views. That's what this passage is really all about. You know, this is not new at all. This goes back to the very early church. And Paul writes this book to this church in Rome, and they're having the same problems. It's maybe not about smoking, and it's maybe not about going to restaurants on Sunday, but it's about some other issues. The particular issues change, but the tendency, the temptation, the problem remains. Throughout time, throughout cultures, it's part of the sinful nature, and it's what the enemy uses to disrupt and really even destroy fellowship and churches. This tendency that we have to judge and to look down on one another. So we're going to talk this morning about what Paul says about this, and then I'm going to offer some reflections about, so what does that mean for us, okay? So if there's a note page in your outline, you might use that if you want to follow along. Before we get to the specific, sort of the principles there, just let's get clear on the background. What's going on here? What's Paul writing about? Maybe some of you, if you're a very committed vegan, you got pretty excited because he's talking about people who eat vegetables and people who don't. It's not a health thing. What was happening in that church, the church in Rome, had a mixture of people who had a Jewish background and people who had a non-Jewish background, and maybe a variety of various religions that they had their background. And so the Jews had a strict menu of things that they could eat and couldn't eat. And the Gentiles had a variety. They could eat anything. However, it also got complicated because some of the people who came into the church, they would eat meat before they became a Christian. A lot of the meats or different kinds of foods were given to God or given as a like a sacrifice to idols. So it was like part of pagan religion that they would dedicate this food to various pagan idols. And so if a person would go in a store, let's say, or a shop, whatever they did back then, and buy food, they wouldn't know if this food, maybe it was sacrificed to an idol. And so they would feel guilty about it. And so they would not eat certain things because it was possible that that food had been offered to an idol. Does that make sense? So some people felt very strongly about this, that if you buy stuff from these people and you eat that food, it's like you're identifying with, you're part of that whole idolatry. So if you're a real Christian, this is where it comes down to now, if you really care about things, you wouldn't eat that stuff because that's been sacrificed to an idol. So you have in this church a certain group of people who wouldn't eat certain things because of that concern. Not only that, but they then looked at the other people in the church who were eating that stuff, and they're like, you are not real Christians. You don't really care about God. And so it was a problem. So there was this issue of food sacrificed to idols. But then the other thing is some of the Jews, they were trying to meld their Jewish background into their Christian faith. And so they were sort of like Christian Jews, right? They were followers of Jesus, but they had pretty strong identification with some of the Jewish traditions, which involved setting certain days aside for worship. There were certain, obviously the Sabbath, but other days that were set apart for God. So they did their Christian connection, and then they also observed some of the days that they had grown up observing as a Jew, but they did that focusing it on God and on Jesus. Meanwhile, the people who didn't grow up Jewish, looked at them and judged them because they're not really Christians. They're sort of half Christians because they're still observing those days, right? And meanwhile, these people who are observing these days are judgmental about those people because in the Old Testament, these days are set aside. So it's sort of like they think it's important to still observe those days. Do you see what I'm saying? Maybe I'm going into more detail than I need to. We get it? We got these people, and they don't hate each other, but they're suspicious of each other, and they look down on each other. And so Paul writes to them this book of Romans, and in this chapter, then he begins to address that particular issue. So the first thing in these first few verses, he makes clear you need to accept people who see things differently than you. He says, accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. Now, you might miss it, but that's what do you mean? Because the person who eats only vegetables, he thinks he's spiritually superior to the person who's compromising his faith and eating all that other stuff. So he thinks he's the one who's superior, and Paul says he's the one whose faith is weak. You see how Paul is sort of entering into and sort of disrupting all their hierarchy. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not, and the man who does not eat everything must not command or condemn the one who does. So, if we have a community of people, and this is always going to happen, that if you start to get a group of people together, the more people you add, the more differences you're going to find. And you start living life together, you start doing things together, you start studying the scripture and trying to apply it to yourself, inevitably, you're going to start finding that some of the people see things a certain way, and some of the people see things a little bit of a different way. And this has dogged the Christian faith from day one. And it's possible some of you here have been hurt by churches because of the infighting that was going on because they couldn't agree about stuff. And then they processed their differences in not Christ-like ways, right? So Paul says, accept those people who see things differently than you. And then secondly, that it's not your place to judge them. So verse 4, who are you to judge someone else's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So he's been talking about food, and now he brings in observing sacred days. One man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God, and he who abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. So ultimately, each of us is accountable to God. And each of us are servants of God. And what we want to do is we want to spend our time getting into other people's business. And what Paul is saying is they are servants of God. They are accountable to God. And you are a servant of God. You are accountable to God. Let God deal with those servants. And you need to deal with yourself before God. And then, in life and in death, our focus this needs to continually be our focus, is our relationship to God, our place as God's servants. Verse 7, he says, none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to God. For this reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. So maybe a good way to think about what he's saying here is, in light of the whole eternity, in light of the fact that you're going to die and stand before God, all this little nitpicky stuff, just let that go. Ultimately, what matters is your relationship to God. And put everything else that you're experiencing and everything that you're thinking about and seeing with other people, just put that in the context of the fact that you are accountable to God. And Jesus came and gave his life so that you could have eternal life. And if you keep that as your focus, it's sort of like all this other stuff doesn't matter nearly as much. So we can say we are followers of Jesus. We don't see everything alike, but we can still be brothers and sisters, right? We don't have to agree on everything. Everyone agrees to that. That's obvious. Of course. But here's the million-dollar question. Whatever it is you're fighting about, is that essential or not? See, here's where we get into trouble. The question of what is essential and what's not. What must we agree on, as opposed to what's just something that we can agree to disagree on, right? I'll tell you what, the church, throughout church history, the church has had battles about all kinds of things. Churches split over all kinds of things. Church members divide into camps about all kinds of issues. I guarantee you, let's say there's, what would you say? Maybe there's 100 different key issues over time, maybe 200, maybe 1,000, however many issues that Christians have disagreed on over the years. I'll bet you a lot of money that in every instance, those people thought it was essential, right? Everyone says, look, we are not going to agree on everything. We have to allow for diversity with unimportant things. But we have to have essentials, or we have to have agreement. We must insist on agreement, perfect agreement, with things that are essential. What's essential? And what is it that we can agree to disagree on? My personal opinion, my personal view, after my years of ministry, is that most Christians think most of the things that they believe are essential, right? Whatever the issue is, you're probably going to think it's essential. Whatever the disagreement is, it's just human nature that we're going to get worked up about it and figure out that this is essential. See, and here's the thing: when I look at when you read the scripture, you will see the Apostle Paul and some of the other not gospel, but the epistle writers, as they're reflecting on the ministry of Jesus, and they're dealing with the meaning of that and people's interpretation of how to live as Christians now. There's some insistence about, okay, if we have differences of opinion, that's a problem. Those people are wrong. You need to follow this path. Okay, there is that. But there's also a surprising generosity. There's a surprising openness that we see. I'll give you two examples. Jesus, at one point in his ministry, I think this was after he'd gone up and had the transfiguration, um, and he comes back, and one of the disciples says, Teacher, we saw someone who is driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. And Jesus says, don't stop him. For no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. Later on, the Apostle Paul, he gets put in prison, and there are people who are proclaiming Christ. They are Christian teachers, and they have disagreements with Paul. And he says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice. I would suggest that we have a more generous view about our differences. And I think of it this way, that if there's an issue, you see it one way, I see it another. If I am convinced that the view that you have is going to keep you from having a relationship with God, is going to keep you from going to heaven, therefore it is essential to whether or not you are a Christian or not, then we can have a disagreement. I'm going to push to have unity. But if there are matters where you just see it differently than me, we've got to figure out a way to make things work, because we are not all going to see everything alike. It didn't happen. I mean, from the very beginning of the Christian church, it wasn't happening, and it's not going to happen now. So here's what this means for us right now, 4 things. So the first, I believe that all of us Christians need to take a big dose of the humility pill. That is to say, I believe this, but I may be wrong. I am convinced that this is the correct interpretation. I am convinced this is essential, this is super important, but there's other people who have different arguments, and maybe there's something that I still have to learn yet. What would happen if we had that kind of humility? How might that change our relationships? How many church splits might have been prevented if people just had more humility to say, yeah, there might be a different way of looking at this. Now, that might raise a question for you, and I'll come back to that. But I want to say one other thing. Life gets easier, and we become more Christ-like when we let God do the judging. I've talked about this before. There is no fear in love, right? Perfect love casts out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. So that reality that oftentimes it's our fear that creates this sense of judgment. We are somewhat insecure about our faith, about the world, and so we fear that if people have different views than ours, that it makes us really uncomfortable. And so we need to somehow resolve this and have certainty. But life gets so much easier when we just say, you may see things differently than me, and I'm just going to let that Leave that between you and God. A scriptural passage I've brought up before, to me, it's become really, really important. It's become actually one of the things that keeps me sane as a Christian, to tell you the truth. And it's the story when, after Jesus had risen from the dead, and he has this dinner with his, or like I think it might have even been a breakfast with his disciples after they've been out fishing, and he's talking to Peter. And this is where Jesus reinstates Peter back into ministry. Because remember, before Jesus was crucified, Peter denied Jesus, denied him 3 times, or denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times. So now this is where Jesus reinstates Peter. And he invites him to be the shepherd of his flock. And then he says that he's going to experience challenges and suffering. And what's the first thing Peter says when he finds this out? The first thing he says is he points to another disciple and says, "What about him? What's going to happen to him?" And Jesus' answer is, not your problem, not your concern. What happens to him is not your concern. You follow me. So when we get challenged as Christians, one of the first things we do is we want, well, what about those people? What about, and Jesus keeps saying this. Paul is saying this. You are God's servant. They are God's servant. They're accountable as God's servant to God. You are accountable as God's servant. So focus on that. And again, I don't want to. This is a bit of a challenging message, but there's such hope here. It's so much better to live this way. There's so much less stress. There's so much more fellowship, and genuine relationship gets so much easier when you're not trying to keep everybody else in line. All right. Let's not forget this. We can still have deep convictions, and we must have deep convictions. We study the Scripture and we get clear in our minds. This is how I believe I need to live as a Christian. This is what it means for me to live as a follower of Christ. And I can have deep convictions about that. But that doesn't mean I need to then insist that everybody else shares those convictions. They might see themselves being a follower of Jesus and living in somewhat of a different way. And again, we're talking about within the church. We're talking about amongst fellow followers of Jesus. All right? And finally, if I'm going to err on one side or the other, I would rather err on the side of being too compassionate. Right? I mean, that to me seems more like Jesus was, more like the way Jesus would be to err on the side of compassion. Some time ago, talking about the vision of our church, we talked about the reality of, in our society today, there are people who are turning away from church. And one of the things that's happening is that people are turning away from the church because of bad experiences they have in the church. And there is some research done about whether Christians whether Christians think and behave more like Jesus or more like Pharisees in a variety of things. And what they found is that too often, evangelical Christians, they behave more like Pharisees than Jesus. And so I just want to really pay attention to that in my own life. Richard Rohr writes this about the Pharisees and that sort of mindset, talking about that particularly as they were opposing Jesus. And he says this: the scribes and Pharisees represent another kind of person in the world today. He's talking about a godly person. And he says the scribes and Pharisees represent another kind of person. In the gospel story, ironically, they're the church people. They're involved with religion, but yet they want nothing to do with healing, freedom, or the giving of life. They watch from a distance, critically observing what's going on in order to accuse. They are men of ill will, but ill will carefully disguised. The best way to be a hateful person and not feel an ounce of guilt about it is to be hateful for God. And some people are like that. I don't want to leave us with that because that's not always the case here. When we have differences of opinion, sometimes it's like we genuinely feel strongly about this and feel like everybody else has to agree with us. I think the Apostle Paul has an important word for the American church today. I think the Apostle Paul has a great word, an important word for Bethel Church today. We're going to see things differently, and we have to figure out ways of keeping our focus on Christ, keeping our focus on being Christ-like, and then knowing what's essential and what we can let go of.